Welcome back to World History 24, where my older sister Ellie teaches me world history in order in just 24 hours. My name is Charlie. In our last episode, we covered the years 300 to 100 BCE. We discussed Ashoka the Great and his edicts. In China, the legalist Qin dynasty fell to the Confucianist Han dynasty. And we ended the episode with the rise of Rome, the Punic Wars, Hannibal's campaign, and the complete destruction of Carthage. In today's episode, we'll cover 100 BCE to 100 CE. During these years, the Trung sisters in Vietnam lead a rebellion against the Han Chinese. Rome turns from a republic to an empire and continues its relentless expansion. They conquer Ptolemaic Egypt, Israel, and Britain, and are stopped eventually at the border of Kush by a queen nicknamed the One-Eyed Kandake. And transitioning from BCE to CE means we'll cover the life of Jesus. And finally, we'll end the episode and Season 2 with the Nasca culture in Peru. So without further ado, let's call Ellie and continue the magnificent story of human history. The year is 100 BCE. We've made it to the long-awaited, at least long-awaited for me, episode 9. We get the inflection point of all of time. That's convenient.
Exactly. We sure do.
What years are we going to be? Yeah, exactly. What years are we going to be covering today?
So today we are going to cover 100 BCE to 100 CE.
Okay, 100 BCE to 100 CE. Sweet. And who do you want to start with?
So we are going to start in Vietnam, in the country that's now Vietnam.
Okay.
And we are going to talk about the Trung sisters and their rebellion against the Han dynasty.
Nice.
And in fact, the land that we're talking about is the northern part of Vietnam and the southern part of what's now China.
Okay.
So we're sort of talking about south of the Yangtze River to the Red River Delta.
Okay.
And in that whole stretch of land, there exists a wide variety, many different groups of peoples who China at least kind of lumps under one umbrella. But as we've talked about with many other groups of peoples around the world, they wouldn't have thought of themselves as the same as each other at all, you know.
Sure.
And they are referred to by China. Unfortunately, we don't have writing from them. So we're going, with names given to them by China. So China refers to them as the Nanman or the Ba Yue, which is the 100 tribes of Yue people. So,
okay.
They're referred to as the Yue. We'll refer to them as the Yue. And interestingly, although it doesn't really sound like it to our ears and in our language, like Yue and Viet are the same word. They're like variations on the same word. So
sure.
Yue is sort of a more like the modern Mandarin pronunciation.
Okay.
And then Viet is like an older, pronunciation, like, Middle Chinese pronunciation. When China describes the Yue, it reminds me a bit of when Greece and Rome talk about the Celts. And they're just kind of like, I don't know who those barbarians are. Like that's exactly the same word, that China's using. And however, we're kind of stuck with those descriptions because we don't have writing, so we're stuck with archaeology and then the descriptions of, a group that sort of views them as an enemy,
right.
Unfortunately.
Right.
But nevertheless, we do, through archaeology, through their art, and through these descriptions, sort of have a sense of their lives and like of the things that they have generally in common, even though, again, it's like a wide, diverse group of people. And so many of the Yue live in small villages. Some live in sort of bigger groups of villages with a king or a chief. And then there's even one or two like large cities with like, kind of big infrastructure. Insofar as we know about their actual, their culture and their ways of life, one thing that's so interesting is that women seem to play important and pretty equal roles in their society, politically and economically. And we're going to come back to that, in sort of the second half of this story. In terms of sort of basic things, we know that they tattooed themselves. They wore their hair very short, which was in contrast to sort of Confucian China, where people wore their hair long. They blackened their teeth. They built their houses on stilts because much of this land is very swampy, very, the wetlands everywhere. They were unbelievable seafarers, just boat people entirely. They're very, very known for their metallurgy. And so we talked about the warring states period and whatnot in China. China's always trying to trade to get to get like UA made weaponry because their weapons are just so well made such that we have swords currently, like today, that are still sharp, made by the UA because they can hold an edge, 2,000 years later or longer.
Crazy. I'll have to trust you that that's cool. I don't know anything about
I don't know anything about metallurgy, but apparently
I
that's
believe
very
that
cool.
Sounds sick.
It sounds cool, exactly. Okay, so then in our last episode, we talked about the Qin dynasty, and we talked about Qin Shi Huang, who again was the emperor who, embraced legalism. He was the emperor who constructed the first wall that was known as the Great Wall, etc. So he founds the Qin dynasty.
Right, okay.
So during the Qin dynasty, of course, Qin Shi Huang is uniting China, right? Which means that he's invading everywhere around China and making it part of China. And so part of that is the conquest of the Baiyue, which is his plan to also conquer the whole southern land. He sends this man, Zhao To, to be the governor of this southern land that he's, united with China. Interestingly, Zhao To immediately sort of assimilates into UA culture. He just more or less he marries a UA woman, he learns their languages, begins their cultural practices, and, that's what he does. In 207, so 1 year before the Qin dynasty falls, he declares himself independent. He's like, we are not part of China. I'm not a governor of the Qin dynasty. I'm just my own. This is my own kingdom. And it's the kingdom of the southern UA, or the non-UA, or Nam-Viet.
The plot thickens.
The plot thickens, exactly. And so then 1 year later, the Qin dynasty falls, and now the Han dynasty is in charge in China.
Right.
The Han dynasty immediately begins invading the UA people. It's not as though they leave them alone because there's been this changeover of power in China. In 111 BCE, Nam-Viet is sort of officially conquered by the Chinese under the Han Emperor Wudi.
Okay.
For a long time, China, although it's officially conquered the kingdom of Nam-Viet, sort of leaves them alone as long as they pay taxes. But over the course of sort of 150 years, they just become increasingly intrusive, increasingly forcing the people to culturally assimilate to China. And they do things like send people who have committed a crime or people who are, being exiled from China down into Nam-Viet, or force people from Nam-Viet to move north to China or whatever. They just do these things to kind of break the culture up. They also are, Confucianist China is very, very patriarchal. As we said earlier, the UA people are, have a lot of equality among men and women in their society. And so that is, people very, very much object to that sort of overturning of their societal norms and their societal structures.
People in Nam-Viet are not liking the taxes. They're not liking the cultural leveraging of men into their society, whatever it is. Yeah.
Yes,
okay,
exactly.
This makes sense.
Exactly.
They're not liking being conquered.
Yeah, exactly. And so, as we've said, time passes. Roughly 150 years have gone by, and this occupation sort of comes to a head.
Mm-hmm.
China has placed this guy, Tu Din, in charge of Nam-Viet, and he's just the worst. He's incredibly corrupt. All he does is just want like higher and higher taxes, and he's just very corrupt. And so he's like finally, like, people are like, we have to do something about this. And so this whole big group of people like get together in secret to be like, how are we going to resist? We need to have an uprising.
A whole big group of Nam-Viet
people. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Tu Din finds out about this meeting and executes all of the men that are at the meeting. And that is his big mistake. Because he doesn't execute the women, because it doesn't occur to him. Well, I mean, I don't know why he doesn't, but presumably because it doesn't occur to him that they're legitimate players in this resistance. So this is taking place in 43 CE. And there's two sisters who are in attendance at this meeting. And their names are Trung Trác and Trung Nhi. And Trung Trác husband is one of the people who gets executed. For being like a traitor, for being at this meeting. In reaction to these executions, the Trung sisters begin this huge rebellion. They rise up. And so they gather this huge army around themselves. They begin capturing or recapturing, reconquering more and more land, more and more territory. They're constantly being underestimated because they're women. Many of the generals in their army are also women, including their mom, which I love. And eventually they capture the capital of the province of Nam-Viet.
Dang. Cool.
Yeah. They crown Trung Trác queen. And this officially ends what is known as the first era of northern dominance.
So first era of northern dominance, that's referring to China.
Exactly.
First era of Chinese dominance over Nam-Viet.
Exactly. So China has controlled Vietnam 4 different times. And this period from 11 BCE, when, they were sort of first invaded by the Han Dynasty.
Xiao Tou.
Yeah, exactly. To 40 CE, that's the first era of northern dominance.
And it's ended by the
Trung sisters
being awesome.
Yeah, just being totally awesome.
Okay.
And so they rule for 2 years, and there's sort of 2 years of relative peace. They push out the invaders. They get rid of all these sort of unjust laws and unjust taxes. But of course, China is not like happy about this. And so in 41, 1 year later, the Han Emperor sends out an army to reconquer them. Depending on what source you look at, there's very different accounts of what happens during this war. But unfortunately, what is agreed upon is that they lose, they fall to China. And they both either die in battle, or they are captured and executed, or they escape and die by suicide, like walking into a river. And then the second era of northern dominance begins. So from 43 CE all the way to 544 CE is the second era of northern dominance. And, during this second era, and during the first, but, it continues during the second, there's just so much forced assimilation, so much forced moving around that, the UA culture just is so scattered. The languages, the cultural practices, et cetera, are so scattered. So there are still, across China and Vietnam, there are still UA people, but just never again is there these massive groups of widely diverse people living over this huge piece of land, sort of at peace-ish. They become more scattered. I mean, again, it feels very much like the Celts to me, or there's a million groups.
Unfortunately, sounds like
it's very, very common.
A familiar story to many like indigenous groups that would be adjacent to a large civilization, if that's the right terms to use in this context.
Large empire,
A large empire, exactly.
Yep. And it's worth saying maybe that the Trung sisters are still in Vietnam, still a huge symbol of resistance and sort of national pride, like all the way through like the Vietnam War that we think of. Like the Trung sisters are evoked. There's statues of them. They're important cultural symbols to this day.
So moving on from Nam-Viet, or leaving it there for now, who's next on the bill?
So next we are going to talk about Rome, and we're going to just kind of briefly talk about the transition of Rome from a republic to an empire.
Okay.
Knowing that we talked about Rome last time, we're going to talk about Rome in our next episode. And so even though this is an incredibly important time in Rome's history, we're going to kind of not like focus on it with a laser, because it's so important to like several of the other stories that we're going to tell. Like they're just in the background the whole time. So I think like we'll be able to see that, if that makes sense. In our last episode, we talked about how Rome was a republic. It had this Senate, and its government ran in a combination of the Senate and then of two consuls who ruled for 1 year at a time together. And they were specifically put in place like that in order to keep people from consolidating too much power. However, what's happened over the course of the last episode, and then entirely during this one, is that the land that's controlled by Rome grows and grows and grows. And we're going to tell a couple of those stories in a minute specifically. But by the end of this episode, Rome is ruling all the way from North Africa, all the way across North Africa, all the way to England. They're just, it's like the expanse of land is just massive. And it might be helpful to think of all the lands that are sort of surrounding the ever-growing Roman Empire. All their sort of kings and queens and other types of leaders are essentially in a chess game with Rome.
Right, I see.
And there's many different ways that that's playing out. In Egypt, various Ptolemaic kings, pay bribes to Rome to keep it from conquering lands, or they offer small pieces of their kingdom. They're like, you can take the island of Cyprus, that's fine, just leave us alone, that vibe.
Right.
And also, of course, the line between an ally and an enemy is not rigid. That's true in the modern world, it's true in the ancient world. And so at any given moment, you might be like, hey, Rome, side with me to fight against a mutual enemy. And then, 2 seconds later, you're in a war with Rome.
You're at each other, yeah.
Yeah. I think of like the US and Russia uniting during World War II to fight Germany. And then immediately 3 seconds later, exactly.
In a war with each other. Yeah. I see. Interesting.
In Mary Beard's book, she sort of says there is no way for an empire to run itself the same way a city ran itself.
Right.
And sort of the government of Rome had been set up to run a city, and now it's like running the known world as far as it's concerned. And
sure.
So what happens is that there just is increasingly so much disagreement about how to govern itself, who gets to be a citizen, who has power, who ought to be running the show. And increasingly, those disagreements become violent. This is the time period. It's in 73 BCE when the gladiator Spartacus rises up, and there's sort of a huge civil war, ends up with 6,000 people being crucified. Eventually in 45 BCE, Julius Caesar declares himself the dictator for life. And then within a few years, he gets stabbed 23 times on the floor of the Senate.
Right.
After that, there's like a 17-year period of chaos. And at the end of it, Octavian, who is Julius Caesar's heir, his great-nephew, declares himself the emperor.
Okay.
He sort of wiped out all of his competitors in various ways. So he renames himself Caesar Augustus. So, if you hear Caesar Augustus or Octavian or Octavius, those are all the same person.
Gotcha.
And so it's during this time, the time period of this episode, that Rome goes from being a relatively stable republic with consuls, that are switched out every year, to being like the Roman Empire that has dictators for life.
So we have our foreboding setup of the Roman Empire in place there. Who do you want to go to first?
So we're going to take 1 second to sort of talk about the general Hellenistic world, and then we're going to focus specifically on Hellenistic Egypt.
Okay, gotcha.
And so, as you remember, at the end of the 7th episode, we talked about Alexander the Great and his invasion throughout this massive, massive space. This space that stretches through the Levant and Mesopotamia all the way to India, and then south through Egypt.
Right.
And so, as we said, his invasion of that space leaves that space very, very Greek.
Right.
Greek culture, Greek philosophy, obviously the Greek language specifically, spreads all through that whole space.
Right. In episode 7, you were like, he's Macedonian, but he's Greek, and he's spreading Greekishness all over the place.
Exactly. Greekishness. Exactly.
So that's the Hellenistic world. Okay.
That's the Hellenistic world. And then Alexander the Great dies right away after he's done that, as we said, in 323 BCE. And that huge empire splits. And there's sort of all this infighting and chaos. And then a few of his generals end up ruling smaller, but still gigantic and still very Greek pieces of the empire, empires themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. Right.
And the two biggest of these are the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic empires, which are ruled, unsurprisingly, by Macedonian generals named Seleucus and Ptolemy.
Okay.
At least to start. Yeah.
Okay, I see.
And so the Seleucid Empire is essentially Persia.
Right. Alexander the Great takes over Persia. Right.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. And the Ptolemaic Empire is essentially Egypt.
Okay. I see.
And so the height of the Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires is what's known as the Hellenistic period.
I see. Okay. Got it.
And so we are going to specifically talk about Hellenistic Egypt or Ptolemaic Egypt. This is the last dynasty of ancient Egypt. We talked ages ago about all the different dynasties of Egypt. This is like the end of this, this culture that we've been talking about since episode 2. Obviously, of course, Egypt still exists now, so also it isn't.
True.
But in terms of sort of what historians call ancient Egypt,
I see.
This is the last dynasty.
This is the 30th through the 33rd, is that right?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
As we just said, this dynasty was founded by a Macedonian general who was a friend, possibly even a relative of Alexander the Great's. His name is Ptolemy the First. And the whole Ptolemaic dynasty, the whole sort of Ptolemaic period of Egypt is very unique to both Greece and to Egypt. It's basically this unique culture that only exists right there and then. It's very, very Greek, but it's also very, very Egyptian, obviously. There's also a large, large Jewish population. They have a lot of wars with the Seleucid Empire, but also a lot of, cultural exchange. So in some ways, it's very Persian also. And there's and then it's also just a Mediterranean, sort of port culture. So there's just the coming and going of the whole Mediterranean world.
Right. Kind of like Carthage or something. Just
Totally.
diverse place.
Absolutely.
Okay. I see. Got it.
And so the Ptolemaic dynasty rules for centuries, right Ptolemy 1 through Ptolemy 15.
Mm-hmm.
And they rule in pairs. There tends to be 2 co-rulers on the throne at once. And those co-rulers are usually married to each other, although sometimes they're siblings.
Mm-hmm.
Very frequently, they are married to each other and their siblings.
Right.
Yeah, the Ptolemies are very known for incest.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, that's what they're famous for.
Right.
Sometimes, though, they're a parent and a child, or, whatever. There's 2 family members on the throne at once. And they view themselves very much as Egyptian pharaohs, as living gods and goddesses. Of course, also, as we said, they're very Greek.
Right.
So one of the first things they do is move the capital to Alexandria. So Alexandria is on the Mediterranean. They want access to Greece. So instead of being in Memphis along the Nile, they move the center of, sort of Ptolemaic Egypt to the Mediterranean. And in fact, Alexandria becomes almost what like Athens used to be or something. It sort of becomes like the cultural capital of the entire Hellenistic world.
Interesting.
And in general, it's this cool city. That's where the Lighthouse of Alexandria is, etc.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Also, of course, and most famously, it's where the Library of Alexandria is.
Before Ellie gets to the famous last queen of ancient Egypt, Cleopatra, we wanted to explore the library in greater depth. As Ellie said, Ptolemy I was tutored by Aristotle. He was a general, a politician, but also certainly a scholar. So it may be no surprise that he constructed a museon, a place sacred to the work of the Muses, who are the patron goddesses of poetry, math, literature, art, and science. And you probably already guessed, but museon is where we get the modern word museum. The collection at the library consisted of scrolls from all over the Mediterranean. Scholars at the library were naturally busy organizing, copying, translating, and standardizing certain texts. This standardization process meant acquiring multiple versions of the same work, debating the variations between them all, and then combining them into an official manuscript. If you've read the Iliad or the Odyssey, you've read a descendant of the versions standardized at the Library of Alexandria. Jewish scholars working at the library made the Septuagint, which is the oldest surviving translation of the Hebrew Bible. Historians at the time estimate the collection contained 500,000 scrolls. And while this number is surely exaggerated, it's a statement about what they viewed as valuable. To be rich and powerful was to be a scholar and to have all the books. But the Library of Alexandria also functioned as more what we would think of today as a university. Scholars lived in the museon. They ate, slept, and studied there, all funded by stipends from the Ptolemaic government. It was a place where one could access all the great works of the day, as well as a place where one could collaborate with and be inspired by their fellow students. The library is where mathematicians and scientists, such as Euclid and Archimedes, wrote their treatises. This collaborative atmosphere of the library gave rise to an explosion of academic and artistic innovation.
And then the very last thing I want to say is just a mythbustery thing, which is that it doesn't burn. That's not true.
Really?
People say Julius Caesar burned it, but it's still there way after the time when Julius Caesar was in Egypt. And then they say that the Christians burned it, but it's still there after that. And then they say that the Arabs burned it, but it's still there after that. So what they now think is just something much more mundane, which is just that, like, as different groups came, they just viewed different pieces of writing as more important, and it just like fell into neglect. Things like papyrus and parchment have to be endlessly recopied, or they'll just kind of rot away eventually over hundreds of years. And it basically just stopped being as valued and sort of disappeared. during the entire Ptolemaic dynasty, Rome has been growing in the background.
Right.
And so by the time we get to Cleopatra VII, Rome is like fully interfering in Egypt's business and literally settling civil disputes amongst their rulers.
Okay, right.
And so Cleopatra VII is the Cleopatra that you think of when someone says Cleopatra.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
She is born in 69 BCE, and she is the last monarch of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the last monarch of ancient Egypt. And so at some point, Rome is called in to settle a dispute between Cleopatra and her brother, who's also her husband. And Julius Caesar shows up to settle this dispute, and instead he and Cleopatra have a baby. Time passes. Julius Caesar dies, as we just said in the previous section, he gets stabbed. And instead, Cleopatra ends up with a different Roman general named Mark Antony. And for years, they essentially rule together. She's, technically on the throne with her son, but, in truth, she's ruling with Mark Antony. And in many ways, she's a great monarch. She's very popular. She wins back all this land for Egypt that her father and grandfather have lost. She stabilizes the financial situation of the empire. And just in general, she and Mark Antony are like pretty beloved. She, unlike most of the Ptolemies, can speak Egyptian, which, obviously endears her to her people.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Imagine speaking the same language as your constituents.
Imagine. They couldn't imagine. So. So you can see how this, sort of stable, expanding, wealthy empire ruled by a Roman general does not sit well with Octavian back in Rome.
Yeah.
And furthermore, not only is it ruled by a Roman general, but Cleopatra is the mother of Julius Caesar's baby.
Yeah.
So many Romans obviously think like that baby should inherit Rome, So this is just a bigger and bigger problem for Octavian. And he kind of starts this massive propaganda campaign against Cleopatra, which isn't hard because the Romans are inclined to dislike her anyway. And, and he's just like, Mark Antony has forgotten how to be Roman, and instead he's just this lame, he's so unmanned, and she's, just this witch who's like a foreign goddess seducer, whatever.
Interesting.
And so that is Roman propaganda. And so I just want to defensively say on behalf of Cleopatra,
I see where you're going. Yeah.
like that is still how we view her.
Totally.
And she's like brilliant. She can speak 9 languages. She's like, and she's just playing chess on behalf of her kingdom, which is her job.
Right.
And trying to keep her son safe. And just anyway, I just feel like we should stop viewing her as like nothing but like beautiful because.
Interesting.
Anyway, that's just Roman propaganda.
Dude, period.
Anyway, that's my
interesting.
take.
Yeah, totally. That is the notion I had. So I appreciate that.
Of course. Yeah. Rome, man, they're powerful.
They are.
And so anyway, the long and the short of it is Octavian eventually is just like, this is untenable. And he invades, Rome invades Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And there's a war, but ultimately Egypt falls.
I see. Okay.
And Egypt falls to Rome and then remains Roman until 641 CE when it falls to the Arab invasion. So, it's like this is it. This is like the end of ancient Egypt. And now Egypt, much like everything else, is a Roman province.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, and as you said, as you alluded to in our like brief Roman interlude there, the Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, Octavian shenanigans that are going on behind the scenes are all a product of this like unruly republic empire transition.
Exactly. Right. And this ever expanding take over the world attitude of Rome. Right. Exactly.
So now they've got from England to Kush.
Egypt. Exactly. And it's funny you should say Kush because that's actually what we're going to talk about next. Yeah, because I just want to quickly talk about Rome meets Kush.
Mm-hmm.
Because, in fact, Kush is the boundary of the Roman Empire, at least along the Nile. And so the Roman army, the Roman Empire has, of course, taken over Egypt, as we just talked about. And the Roman army is like parading down the Nile. And they get to the first cataract, which, if we remember a few episodes back, the first cataract is frequently the boundary between all the lands of, Kerma, of Kush, of Nubia, and of Egypt.
Right.
And so the Roman army gets to the first cataract, and we have all these stories of the Roman army being fought off by this person referred to as the one-eyed Kandake. Kandake, which is interestingly like where we get the like modern name Candace. That's like how it's spelled, except for with the K. Kandake actually are the queens of Kush. That's just the word for like the female rulers of Kush.
Whoa, cool.
If you'll remember when we talked about Kush, we talked about how even way back it was like a pretty matriarchal society, or at least women had a lot of like the wives and sisters and mothers of the kings had enormous amounts of power and were very important to the dynasties. And so At this point, as far as we can tell, there's a woman ruling Kush entirely by herself. And so her husband, her king husband has died, and she's now the queen alone. And her name is Queen Amanirenas. And It's not like 100% sure that Queen Amanirenas and the one-eyed Kandake are the same, but it's like pretty sure, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
She just rallies her army and just fights off Rome, which is just so wild because, like, as we have seen, nobody fights off Rome, but she just fights off Rome. And so Rome has all these strongholds and forts north of the first cataract, and she, goes down and conquers them, basically, just attacks them and keeps like their strongholds from ever crossing the first cataract. During one of those fights, she captures a bronze head of Augustus, of
like
Caesar Augustus, Octavian, the bronze head of a statue, and buries it upside down under the stairs at the Temple of Meroe that we talked about in episode 5. So everyone who's exiting or entering the temple steps on the head of Augustus.
Damn.
I know.
Damn. Wrecked.
I know. I think she's amazing. So then what's interesting, though, about Queen Amanirenas is that she's also just this brilliant politician. She negotiates a peace treaty and then negotiates all these trade relationships. So there actually are, there's like Kushite artwork and goods in the Roman Empire and Roman goods in Kush, so she there is like trade, she sort of maintains actually this relationship with them and this diplomacy, this peace treaty. And, in some ways that's actually what she's famous for, is sort of being like a good political tactician.
Mm-hmm.
But the only actual image that we have of her, like the depiction we have of her, is she's got like a sword in both hands. And she's like feeding her enemies to the lions.
Well, it was a different time.
It was a different time. And I feel like that is what's required if you're trying to keep your kingdom out of Rome's hands. So I have nothing but, respect.
Fair enough.
And so, in fact, Kush does not become part of the Roman Empire. That is the boundary of the Roman Empire, and she keeps her kingdom independent.
Dang.
Yeah.
Cool.
So shout out to Queen Amanirenas.
Shout out to the one-eyed Kandake. That's
exactly.
awesome.
Exactly.
So quick recap. We started in Nam-Viet with the Trung sisters. We moved on to a little interlude about Rome becoming an empire. And we talked about Ptolemy 1 through 15 and Cleopatra and a little bit on Kush.
So what else is happening between 100 BCE and 100 CE?
So we are going to go a little bit north from Kush to the land of Canaan and talk about the life of Jesus.
Okay.
We've been using BCE and CE as our terminology throughout this podcast. I imagine that many of us back in school were using BC and AD. And, BC literally means like before Christ.
Right.
So anyway, Jesus's life takes place during this episode. That is the story that we're going to tell right now. So we left the kingdom of Judah in the Second Temple period with the writing of the Tanakh.
Mm-hmm.
Since then, for the last couple hundred years, Judah has been very much part of the Hellenistic world. Again, Alexander the Great swept through, and Judah is very much pinched between Ptolemaic Egypt and Seleucid Persia. Then in 63 BCE, Rome invades and annexes Judah and all the surrounding lands.
Okay.
They divide it up and put puppet kings in charge of all those various sections.
I see. Okay.
They grant those puppet kings and their families Roman citizenship.
Right. Naturally.
Naturally, exactly. And it's sort of a thank you for helping us invade your land in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least thank you to your families for helping us invade in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Then sort of over the course of this episode, a very kind of familiar story unfolds, whether it's Rome invading a place or honestly like any empire invading a place. A very standard situation is at first they kind of put puppet kings down and they say, as long as you better do what we say, you better stay under our thumb. But as long as you do that and you give us taxes, we don't really care that much about your day-to-day goings on. There's not a lot of direct rule. And and the kings are still your kings. They're your people, your cultural practices, etc.
Right.
And then frequently just 'cause, or frequently as the result of an uprising, more and more kind of power gets taken away from the conquered land and more direct rule gets imposed upon the conquered land.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying sort of over the course of this episode, Rome initially is just annexed and extracting taxes and then starts to clamp down more and more.
Yeah. You're kind of just you're just like a vassal kingdom or something. And then eventually it's you are the Roman province of Judea and we rule you directly. Yeah.
Right.
And so no surprise, during this time, sort of political turmoil abounds. Mm-hmm. There's all kinds of shuffling of power, who's aligned with who has moral authority over who, and much like when we talked about Ashoka the Great, or when we talked about the contention of the 100 schools of thought in China, these sort of periods of enormous political turmoil in which all these different cultures are overlapping with each other also produce a huge blossoming and sort of philosophy and political thought and people trying to figure out, how to make sense of the world. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, during this time period, there's all this Roman influence. There's all the just ancient Judean influence. There's all this Greek influence, Persian influence, all mixing. So there's violence and political turmoil and also just new ideas abound.
Okay.
And so it's into all this, political and, philosophical tumult that Jesus is born. We have two mentions of Jesus in Roman sources, but the vast majority of the story of Jesus's life and doings we get from what is known as the Gospels.
Right.
The Gospels are written decades or even centuries after Jesus's life, which, as we've said, is so normal for religious texts and their stories of people.
Right.
And there are many Gospels, but there's 4 of them that are in the Christian Bible. And those are the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
The story told about Jesus in the Gospels begins with an angel appearing to a virgin girl named Mary, who then gives birth to the baby Jesus in Bethlehem. When Jesus is 30 years old, he's baptized in the River Jordan. During the ritual, a voice from the heavens says, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." Jesus then begins a ministry. He travels around healing people, exorcising demons, performing miracles, and teaching. Many of his lessons are in perhaps familiar parables, such as the prodigal son, the Good Samaritan, or the parable of the sower. He spends time with every type of social outcast, with tax collectors, prostitutes, and lepers. He teaches that the poor and downtrodden are blessed. He preaches that to take care of the vulnerable is to take care of Jesus himself. And as a rabbi, he interprets many old rules, saying that the many laws of the Tanakh could be summarized in two simple commandments: love God and love each other. Because of these radical teachings, he attracts a lot of attention, both from the leaders of the Jewish church and from the Romans. Both groups increasingly accuse Jesus of heresy and sedition as he gains popularity. Eventually, they bribe one of his closest followers named Judas and make a plan to betray him. Knowing that there is a plot against him, Jesus shares a Passover meal of bread and wine with his followers. That night, soldiers arrive with Judas. Jesus is arrested, tortured, and executed by crucifixion. 3 days later, his followers find his tomb open and empty. Jesus appears to his disciples and speaks to them again before finally going up into heaven.
And so, of course, his followers, these followers still exist today. I mean, this is the foundation of Christianity, which 34% of the world now, of the modern world, 34% of the modern world are Christians. And
Right.
so we will follow the story of sort of early Christianity in future episodes. And Christianity is just a major player, basically. Well, it still is. So for the
Totally.
rest of the episodes,
Yeah.
But at the moment, we're going to kind of shelve the story of Jesus and the early Christians and just do an Ellie summarizes a religion and just talk about Christianity.
Cool.
And again, the usual caveat that it's impossible to summarize a religion and that nothing that I say applies necessarily to what early Christians thought or certainly to what any given Christian right now thinks. These are just general outlines. When we talked about Judaism in episode 7, we talked about how the Jewish people are waiting for a Messiah. The Jewish holy book, the Tanakh, is filled with prophecies predicting the coming of a Messiah. In the simplest terms, Christians are followers of the same religion who believe that Jesus was that Messiah, that Jesus fulfilled the messianic prophecies of the Tanakh. And so as such, they believe in the same cosmos as the Jews believe. So they believe in one God who created the heavens and the earth, and everything stems from that God. They believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and that it was through him that everything was created. They believe that there's also a third aspect to the divine being, and that is the Holy Spirit, or the Holy Ghost, which could maybe be described as the force or animating presence of God in the world. Christians believe that these three aspects together are one. They believe that Jesus came down from heaven and became a person on earth. He distilled the commandments of the Tanakh into what he said was the most important, which was to love God and to love each other as he has loved us. He also establishes a new covenant, which is essentially that if you turn towards Jesus, then your sins are forgiven and you have eternal life. Christians believe that Jesus died and was resurrected, and that by doing that, we have been forgiven of our sins. And so many of the religions in this part of the world at this time very much believed in the idea of sacrifice in order to repair a relationship with God. You know, you would sacrifice an animal, or you would sacrifice your child, or whatever. By dying in this sacrificial way for humans, Jesus sort of, for once and for all, made the only sacrifice required. And so no longer is it required for us to perform a sacrifice in order to repair a rupture between us and God caused by our sins. Part of that ultimate sacrifice that healed any rupture caused by our sins is that now humans are offered eternal life. And so after we die, we are judged according to our behavior on earth, according to our sins on earth. And we are sent either to hell, like to a place where we'll suffer for eternity and be apart from God, or to a paradise where we will live forever with God, like in community with God. And so the last thing I want to say about Christianity is that over the course of the first few centuries CE, Christians add another whole set of books to the Tanakh, which they refer to as the New Testament. And then they rename the Tanakh the Old Testament, and the combination of those two is the Christian Bible. The first 4 books of the New Testament are the Gospels, which we talked about, which actually just lay out the story of Jesus. And then also there's many different letters that different groups of people write back and forth to each other, and other, types of writing, like are in any number of the various religious sacred texts that we've talked about, sort of prayers and songs and philosophy, etc., including a description of sort of the end times. And so there's this belief that eventually there will be a second coming of Jesus, and that will bring about the end of times, but again, sort of in a good way. So it'll be this kind of disastrous moment, but then we'll live in peace and harmony.
So wrapping up the summary of Christianity there and the story of Jesus's life, where are we going next?
So actually, we're going to stay here for one more minute.
Okay.
We're going to stay right in this neck of the woods, and we're going to talk about the fall of Jerusalem, because it's only a few decades, after Jesus's death, and it's, within the context of this episode.
Okay, I see.
As we have already seen, this Second Temple period, and specifically the second half of it, is this very volatile time in Judah. And especially when Rome has taken over, and now Judah is the Roman province of Judea. And there's all kinds of civil war, all kinds of uprisings. And of course, as is always the case, there's like intense and violent disagreement about how much to cooperate with Rome. Mm-hmm. There's a group called the Zealots who are vehemently anti-Rome, and at various points they rise up in violent rebellion. Then there's plenty of other groups who feel like, please keep your head down. That's what would keep us all safer. Or even groups who are just like, we do much better under Roman rule. We want the Romans. And,
sure.
I just can't stress enough the obvious point that this is always the case. Whenever there's an occupied people, some of the people are going to be doing better under that occupier than they were under their own government. So there's just always going to be like a wide variety of opinions. Some people, it's not hard to imagine that people would feel oppressed by their own government, and so then here comes an occupying force and they feel liberated by it. So just like, it's probably obvious, but just like there's never two monoliths, even in a situation as straightforward as colonization.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, just quickly on it, Rome, as you've said in previous episodes, does offer some benefits to its citizenry. You know,
Absolutely.
It makes sense that somebody might want to adopt those quote unquote benefits,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
especially if the alternative is being killed and, you know, crucified or whatever. Yeah.
100%, 100%. And even if you don't like Rome and you think they're the bad guys, that still doesn't necessarily mean you have the same idea about how to get rid of them or how to fight back. You know?
Yeah, totally.
However, having said all that, as Rome sort of gets harsher and there's more oppressive taxation, etc., eventually there becomes a moment when sort of many, many Judeans unite and rise up and they push Rome out of Jerusalem.
Okay. And
the Roman Emperor Nero does not like this. And so gathers, an army, sends an army. And in April of 70 CE, under a different Roman emperor at this point, Rome lays siege to Jerusalem.
Okay.
Jerusalem holds out for about 5 months. They have cisterns in their cities, so they have water and, whatever. They do their best. They fight back, they try. But, Rome is essentially unstoppable. Yeah, exactly. And what Rome does ultimately is build a wall around the walls of Jerusalem such that people can't escape and bring food and resource, and supplies and stuff back into the besieged city. They just basically lock them in and
starve
as
them
such they starve. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so as they're starving, Rome finally breaks through the walls of Jerusalem, breaks through their final wall, and just absolutely destroys the city. They kill and enslave tens of thousands of people. It's just like Carthage all over again. They burn the city. They burn the Second Temple.
Yeah.
And this is the beginning of what's known as the Jewish diaspora. This is the beginning of the time when, sort of the Jewish people view themselves as being, spread out, being, exiled from their home city.
Gotcha. So this ends the Second Temple period.
It ends the Second Temple period, exactly. It does.
Okay, wrapping up the origins of Christianity and the beginnings of the Jewish diaspora. What else is happening between 100 BCE and 100 CE?
So now we are going to go north, far north, all the way to what's now England, what's now Britain. And we are going to talk about Boudicca.
Okay, cool. We have never been to England.
No, Exciting. We have never been to England. Exactly. And this is going to be just kind of another little sort of short story about fighting off the Romans.
I see.
Because, that is just the story that dominates this entire world, of course.
Mm-hmm. Even though they're thousands of miles away from the rest of the stories we've been telling about this.
Yeah. I mean, Sudan and England, at the same time. It's wild. Yeah. Wild.
Yeah.
So we are in England. England has been invaded by the Romans in 43 CE.
Okay.
And it has become the Roman province of Britannia.
Okay.
And so, as of course is always the case, they originally conquer a certain space, but then those borders keep getting pushed on. They keep pushing out, expanding. And so there's sort of endless wars and, resistances to those wars.
Sure. They've conquered a small piece of England and then they're ballooning out to try to get the rest, basically.
Yes. Exactly. Okay. Exactly.
Okay.
So the Roman emperor at this point is Nero. Nero, I think, is sort of maybe famously a pretty bad dude. If if you just sort of rings in your ears, it's ugh, Nero, So that's you just keep that in the back of your head.
That's the right way for it to ring, though?
Yes, it is the right way for it to ring.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay.
So in this large Roman province of Britannia, there's a group of people called the Iceni people. And so they're, a Celtic people, roughly. Again, that word captures a wide variety of people. But, there's a Celtic group called the Iceni.
Okay.
And their king is named Praetorius.
Okay.
His wife, the queen, is Boudicca.
Okay. Praetorius and Boudicca are the king and queen of the Iceni.
Exactly. And we sort of know a weirdly lot about this story because the Roman historian Tacitus is related to the Roman general that was there at this time. So we sort of have like a bizarrely, not quite a first-hand account, but like a second-hand account, through this Roman historian Tacitus.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. So Praetorius works a lot with Rome. He's one of the kings who's kind of like, I'll do what you say as long as you sort of leave me alone. And Rome is kind of fine with that. Is like takes a lot of tribute and sort of leaves them alone. However, Praetorius dies in 60 CE and he leaves his kingdom to his daughters and to the Roman Emperor Nero. Again, it's all a chess game, and maybe Praetorius thought this was the best move for his people. However, Rome completely takes advantage of this move and comes in and just plunders the Iceni people, like especially anybody that's remotely important, of the Iceni people. And specifically, they go after Boudicca and they flog her, sort of publicly whip her and assault her daughters.
Okay.
And so this enrages the Iceni people. And Boudicca starts an uprising. She reaches out to all these leaders of the neighboring groups, like the neighboring tribes. They all unite together under her, sort of crown her queen of this bigger group. And she leads a massive uprising against the Romans.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. And eventually she has like 120,000 soldiers fighting under her.
Jeez.
They continue to take land back from the Romans. They conquer the Roman stronghold of the province of Britannia. They, free all these people that the Romans had essentially enslaved. They end up killing something like 70,000 Romans. These numbers, who knows? These numbers are always like hard to actually pinpoint, but that's the story anyway.
Wow.
It ends in this sort of catastrophic battle called the Battle of Watling Street. And ultimately, unfortunately, Boudicca is defeated.
Okay.
And so, again, just like we talked about, when we were talking back about the Trung sisters, that, it's unclear if she was killed in the battle, if she was assassinated by Rome, or if she died by suicide. Like all three of those stories exist.
Okay, I see.
But either way, at this point, Rome just fully holds Britain. And it holds it until 410 CE.
Wow. So her rebellion lasted just a year.
Yeah, just a year. And it's interesting because it's actually just a total coincidence. It was weird as I was researching this episode, how I was like, apparently this episode is the episode of like women fighting empires.
Totally.
But much like the Trung sisters, Boudicca is like this symbol of resistance against like a oppressive body, an oppressed, like an empire.
Awesome. We got to start getting our merch together. We can have Boudicca t-shirts.
Exactly. I'm with her.
Okay, so we leave Britain there. What else is happening between 100 BC and 100 CE?
So now we're going to leave this whole, Roman Empire neck of the woods, and we're going to go all the way across the world, and we're going to talk about the Nasca culture, who are in Peru.
Okay, we're spinning the globe. Cool.
The Nasca culture exists sort of between 200 BCE and 600 CE. And of course, standard disclaimer, these dates are fuzzy. It's hard to say at exactly what point it's the Nasca culture as opposed to a group, that came before them or after.
Mm-hmm.
And so what the Nasca culture is the most famous for are what's known as the Nasca lines, which are these huge geoglyphs that are etched into the ground, and you can really only see if you're looking down on them because they're so big and they're drawn into the ground. So you really only have the proper view looking down. And we're going to come back and talk about those in a minute. But first, I just want to give a general description, of Nasca culture. So we are in the south of Peru along the coast, and this is a very, very dry land, a very arid land, which influences a lot of aspects of this culture. However, they managed to grow this very varied, rich agricultural diet. And a lot of the diet is based on the Three Sisters, on squash, beans, and corn, or maize. And so at this point, when we were talking in episode 2, and we were talking about the Norte Chico, and we were like, by the very end, corn was sort of just starting to appear, that kind of thing. Now it's like corn is a staple in this diet. It is thoroughly spread.
Okay.
They have a capital city called Ventia, which has terraced homes and, big round walled plazas, big round open spaces. It also has very elaborate aqueducts and other systems of moving water, which we'll come back to again in a minute. There's also another place called Kawachi, which doesn't appear to be a city, but it does seem to be this big, important site with all these plazas and mounds in it. And the guess is that it's like a pilgrimage site or a religious site. And it's right along the Nasca River, and it's one of the few places in sort of the whole Nasca land that there's water reliably year-round. Possibly that is why it's a religious site, or that's part of the sort of pilgrimage, what makes it holy. The Nasca had unbelievably cool pottery and textiles, which I'll put on, the website so that you can see. And what's cool about them, aside from just being beautiful, is that there's a lot of depictions of life on them. So they're not just like cool designs. They offer a lot of insight into the way that the people were actually living, because there's drawings on the pots of what people were doing or woven into the textiles.
Wow, cool.
A lot of the artifacts that we have are because we have grave goods. We find them in graves. There's many grave goods, and there doesn't seem to be any distinction between the grave goods in graves of men and graves of women.
Okay.
And so that might give us some insight into, the cultural practices around, roles.
My favorite aspect of the Nasca archaeological record is their ceramic instruments. What you're hearing is a Nasca antara, or panpipe, played by the musician Esteban Valvidia. Like all panpipes, these handheld instruments are simply a row of pipes that you blow into like a flute. The length of each pipe determines the pitch, or frequency. However, as I said, these panpipes are ceramic as opposed to wood or reed. To make these instruments, the Nasca used fine-grained clay to mold each tube delicately around a stalk. Then 2 sheets of coarser-grained clay were used to bind them all together. This technique left small resonant gaps between the tubes and gave the Nasca panpipes the overall appearance of a wing. Within the wing, each tube is kind of shaped like a narrow wine bottle with a really short neck. So each straight tube has a narrow section at the opening and then a much longer, wider section. This shape means that playing into one tube produces 2 fundamental frequencies. The ratios of the frequencies from one pipe to the next are precise, and they subtly avoid harmonic fourths, fifths, and octaves in favor of larger ratios and worlds of dissonance. And don't forget, ceramics shrink during firing, so the precise final tuning is evidence that instrument makers accounted for the increase in pitch as the instrument inevitably shrank in the kilns. We have many Nasca portrayals of people playing the panpipes from their textiles and pottery, images of spiritual dances and musicians in pairs or groups. Archaeologists find these panpipes in what they assume are offerings, spiritual caches of precious objects left near temple mounds, or sometimes near the lines that Ellie's about to describe. All of this, and the stunning design of the panpipes themselves, make it clear that music was central to the cultural and spiritual practices of the Nasca.
So then we have what's known as these Nasca lines, which are very much like what they're famous for. And these are, again, these geoglyphs. And Nasca line almost is a misnomer because it gives the impression that there's something small, like a line sounds small to me. But in fact, these are these massive, massive drawings of spiders and birds and spirals and other things that are drawn into the actual ground of the land of the Nasca people.
Right.
And so the actual literal earth of the land where the Nasca people live is this yellowish brown color.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's covered over with a layer of like rocks and sand and other things. And so how the Nasca lines were made was essentially by scraping away, like digging down and making a trench through the rocks and sand, exposing that yellowish brown color. And then they would use those trenches to just draw these huge, again, like birds and plants and lines and other things. And so you can literally see them from Google Earth.
Right. Cool.
Like
cool.
I'll link on the website, but like they're just really, really cool and like absolutely still visible, 2,000 years later. Yeah.
And do we know like, I feel like maybe the obvious question is like, do we know what they're for, what the function of them was, or ritual,
the short, exactly. The short answer, unfortunately, is sort of no.
Okay.
They say like ritual or whatever, but like, what does that mean specifically?
Right, in this context.
Who knows? Yeah, especially because some of them are so big. There's a line, it's just a perfectly straight line that's 15 kilometers long.
Dude, what? Like over the mountains and stuff?
Absolutely, over the mountains. And like, first of all, the engineering of that is just like absolutely unimaginable. I can't even begin.
How do you make something straight?
But it's also just like what, we now have Google Earth, we have airplanes, whatever, we can look down and be like, cool spider. But like if you're standing, it's just so neat to imagine like what they were for. And so the last thing I want to say about the Nasca is just that their aqueducts are so cool.
Okay. Cool.
And one thing that's just wild about them is like they're actually still in use to this day. Like they're so solidly built and so well engineered that like 2,000 years later, they're still watering people's crops.
Crazy. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really, really cool. And so again, like the land that the Nasca live in is so arid, as we've said, there's basically no water above ground. This is not like the Nile flooding, easily into, systems of channels and whatever,
Sure.
This is, they have to tap into water that's flowing underground.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And so what they do is they just build this elaborate system of tunnels to make the water flow, basically starting in high ground. They tap into the water table at high ground and then have like an elaborate system of like channels and reservoirs and whatnot that bring the water down to where they need it. And some of these tunnels are like kilometers long. I mean, it's just sort of an unbelievable It's like impossible to really imagine how they were built, but nevertheless, there they are, and you can see them. And like I said, people are still using them.
Crazy.
There's also these like huge stone spirals that create an access point. Like at the bottom of them, they spiral down, they funnel down into the underground tunnels. And for a long time, we didn't understand why they were built in spirals like that.
What?
And we thought it was just like...
Are you about to tell me?
We thought it was just about it being like a staircase, or it was somehow good for maintenance, for cleaning the well, for getting down into it. But what they now think is that the wind moves across the spiral in such a way that it like spirals down into these holes and like pushes the water underground.
No.
Yeah.
Nope.
And again, still in use today.
What?
Right.
Is that what happens?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll link you to the academic articles like of people arguing that that's what's happening, that's their purpose.
The wind spirals down and pushes the water.
They're like capturing the wind purposefully by like the way that the spirals are built.
Meanwhile, the Romans get all the credit for aqueducts when they just build straight lines.
They just build lines through valleys, which, you know, they're dope, but whatever.
I was going to say, they're totally cool. Yeah. Not to rip on that.
No,
but,
what I more think is that the Nasca are very famous for their lines, which are unbelievably cool, but I'm like, their engineering is like...
Yeah, clearly.
Such an outlier. It's such an outlier, and it's like weird that it's kind of not forgotten. I don't know.
Yeah, they're overshadowed for that one thing. Interesting.
Yeah. And so then sometime in about the 600s CE, there's decades of climate problems, droughts, etc. And at some time in there, the Nasca are sort of replaced by another group called the Wari. Sometimes this is characterized as an invasion while they're vulnerable to these droughts. Other times it's characterized as just like a long period of overlap and just kind of eventually the Wari are who's there.
Okay.
Either way, around the 600s is when the Nasca civilization comes to an end. And that's kind of the end of our episode. That, you know, sort of brings us to 100 CE.
100 CE. Crazy. Dude, what a crazy episode. So much resistance against big
against
empires.
The empire.
And exactly. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, I will see you in episode 10. We're almost in our own double-digit situation here.
Ooh, that's exciting.
And with that, we come to the end of our 9th call, covering from 100 BCE to 100 CE. We discuss the Trung sisters and the origins of Vietnam, the Roman transition from a republic to an empire, the end of Pharaonic Egypt, and the successful resistance by the Queen of Kush. We talked about Jesus, Christianity, and how Jerusalem fell to the Romans. We told the story of Boudicca fighting to keep Britain free from Rome, and finally, we looked at the Nasca culture in Peru. With this episode 9, we also end season 2. We can't wait to see you in 2026 for season 3. Stay tuned for the Silk Road, the first outbreak of the bubonic plague, the fall of Rome, the rise of the Mayans, the life of Muhammad, and the spread of Islam. Bye, Ellie.
Bye, Charlie.
We love hearing from you. Every comment, question, and email means so much to us. You can support us directly through Buy Me a Coffee. We are also now affiliates of bookshop.org, which is a great online book buying alternative to Amazon. Bookshop.org allows you to shop online, but still through real indie bookstores. It's no extra cost or hassle and helps us a ton. Click on the support link in the episode description to check it out. World History 24 is written and researched by Ellie Cazella. I do the production and music. Special thanks in this episode to Esteban Valvidia for his recording of Nazca Antara. Our logo and design work is done by Alyssa Alarcón Santo. For links to any sources mentioned in the episode, as well as lots of fascinating extra material, visit worldhistory24.com. That's worldhistory24.com. My name is Charlie Cazella, and on behalf of myself and my sister, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next hour.